Hello, welcome to Unit 3 of our course. I look forward to working with you during this unit. In this unit, we will be exploring a variety of topics from the 1950s and early 1960s. One topic that we will explore is the Civil Rights Movement. You will be watching a film on the Civil Rights Movement. The film is entitled Let Freedom Ring: Moments from the Civil Rights Movement. It's, I think, a rather good documentary covering important aspects of the struggle of African Americans' struggle for equal rights in American society. As you know, throughout American history, African Americans faced severe discrimination and repression. This, of course, began with the long and horrific history of slavery. But the discrimination that African Americans faced continued, of course, long after the abolition of slavery. Slavery was abolished in 1865 at the end of the Civil War. However, this brought about a new era of discrimination. Jim Crow laws and segregation would continue to be major obstacles in the path towards equality. The film will focus on the Civil Rights Movement in the 1950s, 1960s. After World War II, there is tremendous renewed energy in the Civil Rights Movement. It should be noted the Civil Rights Movement began long before World War II. In fact, there had always been individuals struggling for racial equality in America. Even during the period of slavery, individuals like Frederick Douglass spoke in defense of racial equality. There was renewed energy in the Civil Rights Movement following the Second World War. There are a variety of reasons for this. One was the war itself. One of the stated goals of the United States during World War II was to fight against racism and discrimination. This was expressed in opposition to the regime of Nazi Germany. And of course, the Nazis demonstrated the ultimate horrors that racism could lead to, mass genocide. There was a renewed energy to fight against racism after the war. And the Civil Rights Movement gained momentum in the post-war period. Many individuals participated in the Civil Rights Movement and demonstrated tremendous courage in doing so. It took a great deal of courage and bravery for people to stand up and to reject the existing racial norms, stereotypes, the existing racial discrimination that existed in society. At a time when African Americans could not vote in the American South, essentially, and when there were separate parks, separate drinking fountains, separate bathrooms, separate seating for African Americans and for Caucasians, it took a tremendous amount of courage for people to stand up and to reject this as unjust. Yet, thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people participated in the Civil Rights Movement. Many of these individuals, of course, were African American, although I would note that people of many different races were involved in the Civil Rights Movement. And there were whites or Caucasians who certainly supported the Civil Rights Movement as well. So it was a multiracial effort to overcome discrimination and oppression. Tremendous progress was made in the 50s and 60s, but not without cost. Some individuals sacrificed their lives in the pursuit of equal rights. Dr. Martin Luther King, of course, being perhaps the most famous example of an individual who died, in a sense, as a martyr for equal rights, for equality, as he was assassinated because of his stance on civil rights. I think you'll find the film to be very powerful. It includes a lot of news clips from the era. I think you'll find it to be... There are aspects of it that are disturbing, are troubling. I mean, you see the level of racial oppression that existed in the 50s and early 60s depicted in the film quite starkly. And it can be quite shocking. the armed guards that soldiers had to escort African American high school students to school in Little Rock, Arkansas, because of fear of mob violence, as there was an effort to racially integrate the school. So you'll see that the extremes of racial oppression and racial violence that existed in the era. It's also, I think, though, a very uplifting film, because it shows the courage and bravery of the people who did engage in the struggle for equal rights, and it does demonstrate that over time they began to triumph and to change American society. Of course, racism still exists in America. We all know that, and more progress needs to be made. And I think the film can be inspiring in that sense. These were people like you and me who stood up courageously to oppose what they understood to be unjust. And they did change America for the better in the process. So that's one topic we will explore. Another topic we will be exploring is the reaction to Sputnik. That's the feature essay for this week. The feature essay for this week is entitled Reaction to Sputnik, and you will be asked to answer the questions related to that text. Sputnik was a Soviet satellite. Sputnik was the first man-made object to be launched into Earth orbit. In 1957, the Soviet Union successfully launched the satellite Sputnik into space. Sputnik circled the Earth as a satellite, broadcasting a pinging message. It was remarkable, a remarkable scientific achievement and a remarkable scientific feat. It sparked utter terror in America for several reasons. If the Soviets could launch a satellite into space, this clearly revealed that they had the technology to strike any part of the world with weapons. It was not a great leap to go from launching a satellite into Earth orbit to launching nuclear warheads to any point on the globe. The Soviets clearly were beginning to develop that technology and perfect that technology. So it had military implications. It also sparked a tremendous reevaluation amongst Americans. How had we fallen behind? The United States had tried to launch a satellite into space and had failed dismally. And there was fear that the Soviets were moving ahead of us in the space race, that they were moving ahead of us in technology. And it did lead to significant educational reforms. Generally, throughout American history, state and local governments have controlled educational policy. Generally, it has been states who have established curriculums and guidelines for education. With the launch of Sputnik, the federal government inserted itself into American education in a way that it never had before. The federal government instituted reforms to emphasize math and science education. More rigorous standards were introduced in American public schools in the fields of math and science. The overarching goal was to ensure that America would remain at the cutting edge of science and technology. But to do that, the federal government took a leading role in public education, really for the first time. Of course, today we're very accustomed to the federal government being very involved in public education. That is a legacy in many ways of the crisis surrounding Sputnik, surrounding this element of the Cold War. The third and final topic that we will be considering this week is gender norms. Gender norms are the stereotypes, the cultural expectations for women and men in society. Every culture, every society develops some form of gender norms. In other words, expectations regarding how men and women will behave on the basis of their gender. It's a cultural construct. It's created by society. Cultural norms, gender norms, of course, can change and shift over time. In this unit, we will be examining the gender norms that were prevalent in America in the 1950s. In the 1950s, gender norms were very extreme in America. Men and women were viewed radically differently and faced very, very different expectations regarding their lives and their behavior. This, in many ways, is deeply troubling. Men and women were essentially assigned different roles in society in the 50s, and there was tremendous pressure for men and women to conform to these roles. If you think of the 50s, perhaps television shows like Father Knows Best and Leave It to Beaver come to mind. These were, the media in the 50s portrayed very strict gender norms. Men were portrayed as going off to work, as breadwinners for the family, earning income, whereas women were always portrayed in the media as being homemakers, stay-at-home mothers, caring for children, caring for the household. And this was the dominant message that was portrayed in American media, in magazines, in film, on television. The overwhelming message sent out to both American women and American men was that men and women have different roles in society. Men's primary role is to labor for income, and women's primary role is within the household as caregivers. This was the dominant message. And people faced pressure to conform to this ideal. Marriage rates were incredibly high in the 50s. The average age of marriage was very young in the 1950s. Women in the 50s were frequently getting married in their late teens or early 20s, and men were generally getting married in their early to mid-20s as well. Very few people remained single into their mid to late 20s in the 1950s. Birth rates were incredibly high in the 50s, which of course conformed to this domestic ideal of gender norms, of the ideal, the message that women's principal role was raising children. The birth rate was very high. Part of this was the fact that the birth control pill or contraception hadn't been introduced yet. The birth control pill is not approved by the FDA until 1960. And therefore, average family size did tend to be larger, partly as a result of that. Also, the early age of marriage led to larger families. Men and women were married now throughout a longer period of their reproductive lives. The pressure on women, there was tremendous pressure on women not to enter the paid labor force, especially for middle-class women and upper-class women. There's tremendous pressure not to enter the paid labor force. Interestingly, and surprisingly perhaps, there was a inverse relationship for women between educational attainment and workforce participation. In the 50s, the women who were most well educated, college graduates, were the least likely to be employed in the labor force. Very few female college graduates worked outside of the home. In contrast, women who had received relatively little formal education, women who had not graduated from high school, or women who had high school degrees but had not gone on to college, had much higher workforce participation rates. That was a reflection of social class. Middle to upper class women generally married men from the middle to upper class with professional jobs, and as a result, economically, these families could survive on a single income. So for middle and upper class families, it was possible economically for women to stay at home, not to enter the workforce. In contrast, for women from the working class or women who were poor tended to marry men from the working class, and generally there is much more economic pressure for these women to enter the labor force, simply because it would be impossible or very difficult to survive on a single income if the male in the household had a job that was not well paying. So women who are receiving the most education generally were entering the labor force. The women were not encouraged in the 50s to pursue professions, to pursue careers. And I think that's one of the most disturbing aspects of the gender norms of the 50s. Women were actively discouraged from entering the professions by and large in the 50s. Many graduate schools, law schools, and medical schools still discriminated against women. Some did not admit women. Many companies would not hire women in professional jobs. Women faced a lot of discrimination in that realm. There were many jobs available to women in the 50s, and many women did enter the workforce in the 50s. But the jobs tended to be skewed towards the lower end of the income spectrum. Clerical jobs, secretarial jobs were abundant for women, but it was difficult for women to sort of break the glass ceiling and enter the professions or achieve high-paying jobs in corporate America due to blatant sexism and overwhelming cultural pressure not to do this. For example, the Smith graduating classes of the late 1940s. Smith College is regarded as a women's Ivy, a highly ranked women's college. If you look at the graduates of the school in the late 40s, who clearly were very well educated, very few entered the labor force. The vast majority, after graduating, married, started a family, and stayed at home. Now, it is important to consider and to note that I don't want it to seem as if there's a suggestion here that there's something wrong with pursuing the path of being a stay-at-home mother. Obviously, that's not what anyone would try to convey. The problem is that women weren't really given many choices. Women should, of course, as men, be able to choose their path in life and decide what they want to do on their own. And the problem in the 50s was that all women were pressured to pursue a single path. So it's not that scholars are critical of the notion of stay-at-home motherhood or not entering the workforce. It's that the women really didn't have a lot of options. They weren't presented with a lot of opportunities. So I think we can all agree that it's troubling when the culture does not allow women to have the choice, basically. It was very difficult. Not impossible. There were women who entered the professions. There were women who pursued a career path in the 50s, but it was very, very difficult. It was incredibly difficult, given the many cultural obstacles, the many sexist obstacles that existed. I should say that men also faced pressure in the 50s. And you don't hear as much about that, I think, but there was a prevailing cultural expectation for men in the 50s as well. Men were expected to be providers or quote-unquote breadwinners for families. Men were expected to marry at a relatively young age, get a full-time job, work long hours, make a good income, and support their families. This was the path that was set for men. Men were certainly discouraged. The notion of men staying at home and being caregivers for children was discouraged. That was viewed as aberrant. men were discouraged from pursuing that path. And of course, there's nothing wrong with that choice either. That's a choice that was shut off to men. Men were actually in the 50s largely discouraged from playing any sort of significant nurturing role to their children. The cultural expectation was that women would take the primary role in raising the family, and that men could work at any time. Men, it was assumed, could work late at night, men could work on weekends, because the cultural assumption in the 50s was that men had no responsibilities at home. That men had wives who cared for everything that was going on at home, and therefore they could work whenever the corporations wanted them to, whenever their bosses wanted them to work. So men often, there was this pressure that the only defining aspect of a man's life was his job, his profession. That was his identity, which also could be very constraining and didn't necessarily conform to what all men wanted to do. And I think that's the problem with these gender stereotypes most fundamentally, and is that it takes an entire group of people, in either case roughly half the population, and suggests that there's one particular way they should lead their lives, which is of course not true. Men and women are diverse. Men and women have different interests, different paths, different goals in life. And the 50s didn't really allow that to be realized. Some other examples or notes about this. Some people did rebel against the gender norms. Betty Friedan wrote a book called The Feminine Mystique. Betty Friedan came from an upper middle class family. She was a graduate of Smith College in the late 1940s, and like most of the graduates of Smith and other schools, she married, and she didn't enter the paid labor force. She raised a family, and later on, after her children were grown, she reflected on her experiences, and it's not that she regretted having a family and raising a family, but she did feel that she wished she had pursued a career earlier. She wished that that was also an aspect of her life. And she decided to conduct a survey of other Smith College graduates and ask them about their experiences, and she found that she was not alone. She found that other women felt the same way, that they had not really been given many choices or opportunities, and that this was unjust. Hence, she published a book about this experience, The Feminine Mystique, in which she railed against the lack of opportunities that women encountered. And she was a founding member of the organization called NOW, the National Organization for Women. Sloan Wilson wrote a book as well, The Man in the Gray Flannel Suit, in which he explored the gender pressures faced by men in corporate America. Sloan Wilson served in World War II as an officer. After the war, he entered corporate America, married, bought a house, had a family, was pursuing what society told him that he should do. But he found that his job in corporate America was not fulfilling. He was part of a vast sort of corporate army. He was expected to wear the same suit as everyone else. There was a uniform at the company. Everyone was expected to work long hours, work weekends, and generally be distant from their families. He found that he was making a lot of money, buying a bigger house and, more and more things, but he never got to spend any time with his family or be part of their lives, and he found that this was not fulfilling. So he wrote a protest against this. He ultimately quit his job in corporate America and became an author. Of course, not everyone had that choice or ability. So there were some emerging protests. I'll be interested to hear your thoughts on this topic. Of course, here at Bay Path, you're all the students here are women pursuing an advanced education, oftentimes with the goal of furthering their careers and furthering their pursuits in the labor force. So it'd be interesting to hear your reflections on this topic of gender norms, certainly. I look forward to working with you during this unit. Thank you.